It's an honor to be here, watching the developments that are taking place under our eyes with the emergence of the United Left and the EDS and the remarkable role it's playing really is in some ways very humbling, given how little is going on in this respect in my own country despite our best efforts. So really it's an honor to be here. Now, it's strange for me to think about this because I don't like to think that I'm so old. But 25 years ago, exactly 25 years ago, I was in the former Yugoslavia, in Kumrovich, speaking about parties, communist and social democratic parties, 25 years ago. The reason I was there, I'm not the type of Marxist that normally would have been invited by the League of Communists to the party school to talk about parties. The reason I was there was there used to be, those of you closer to my age will remember this, there used to be every year in Savtat, not far from Dubrovnik, an annual meeting called Socialism in the World, which the party organized. It wasn't a government event, it was a League of Communists event. And because of Yugoslavia's very special place in the non-aligned movement, it really did have socialists from all over the world every year. From China, from Cuba, from Quebec, from the United States, from all over Europe. And in those days, because Gorbachev was already in place, from the Soviet Union and East Germany and so on. And it was a very strange event. I was invited the first time in 1988. I think the last one was in '89, which is when I spoke in Kumrovich. And because, even though it was a party and presumably an intellectual event, it nevertheless had all of the trappings of a diplomatic meeting. And the hosts were very concerned that nobody should feel that they were in any way slighted. So they organized the presentation of the papers in alphabetical order. So you would get a paper on women in Algeria that would be followed by a paper on Quebec nationalism. That would be followed by a paper by Mike Leibovitz on the limits of industrial democracy in Yugoslavia. And it was bizarre. It was intellectually, as a conference, not very satisfying, although the discussions in between sessions, with meeting interesting people, was often fascinating. When I was invited the following year, because it wasn't such, it was organized in such a bizarre way, I was reluctant to go. And my friend Michael Leibovitz, who many of you will know, he's often been here, said, no, come and I'll arrange for you while you're coming to also meet other people, go somewhere else where you'll get a sense of what's really going on in the country. So I got this invitation to go speak in Kumrovich at the party school. And it's always been my practice when I've been invited to speak, when I was invited to speak in countries where there was a Communist Party regime, including in Cuba, that I would try to introduce them, and especially at a party school I wanted to do this, I would introduce them to a very important book, written a century ago, exactly a century ago, by a European journalist, Italian, Swiss, German, French, really one of those remarkable Middle European intellectuals, whose name was Roberto Michels. And he wrote a book called Political Parties, The Iron Law of Oligarchy. How many people in the room have heard of this book? One. Good. Nobody of the 300 men, and they were all men, that were in suits at the party school when I was introduced to speak to them. Nobody, of course, had heard of this book. In the Bolshevik tradition, only one of the great Bolshevik leaders acknowledged that this book had been written. That was Bukharin, who said it posed a very important question and challenge which we need to take seriously. And here is the thesis of this book. He says, obviously, the conservative parties, even the liberal parties, have no real interest in democracy. The reason they have become mass parties is because once workers won the right to vote, they had to create the means of getting their people who were already in an undemocratic parliament, elected only by property owners. They now had to find the means of getting the masses to vote for them. So they created large party organizations. Before that, they were just parliamentary elites. The big test of whether we can really have democracy or not has to be to look at the workers' parties. They are created outside of Parliament. They have been the key institutions which have won for workers the right to vote since they emerged in the last quarter of the 19th century. And if democracy is possible, it will be because these parties really are democratic themselves. And he says, if you take, and his example is the great German Social Democratic Party, which begins in the 1860s, by the 1870s, becomes a Marxist party explicitly. Marx very famously writes his critique of the first elaborated program of that party, the Gotha program, in 1875. And by the 1890s, despite having to be underground and illegal during the 1880s, it becomes a great mass party with hundreds of thousands of members, starts electing people to state and municipal level governments, gets into parliament, even though that parliament in a monarchy regime doesn't have, of course, control over the executive. And Michels looks at this party and he says it begins as a very, very democratic party. The party leadership is elected by the delegates of the masses. There is an annual party convention. In the German party case, and this really was very much the case there, unlike in the British case with the Labour Party, there was a tendency not to try to nominate middle-class professors as their candidates. They used to have a tendency, in constitutional requirement, that it would be working-class candidates who would be given priority to become representatives of the workers, etc. And Michels traces what happened to the Social Democratic Party by World War I. Not in the sense that you will know the famous debates between the reformists and the revolutionaries, the debates between Luxemburg and Bernstein over revisionism. No, he was interested in the question of, was the party democratic? Did the mass membership have control over the leadership? And he says, look at what has happened. Changing the world from socialism, from capitalism to socialism is not a hobby. It's a difficult and dangerous process. You can't do it part-time. So it's inevitable that socialist organizations will create full-time organizers and representatives. People who will be paid by the party. And they will spend their days doing party work. They will be elected. But since they are there full-time, They will have control over the party press. They will have control over the party finances. They will have control over the dues that go into the bank accounts and where they're spent and how they're spent. And they will have control over when conferences are called and what the agenda of conferences will be. Of course, they will be subject to the ratification by the Congresses of all of those decisions. And in that sense, you could say the party would be democratic. But he says there are certain organizational tendencies which inevitably create a counter-tendency to democracy. And that is that these people are spending more of their time as the representatives of the workers in Parliament, and they spend their days interacting with the aristocrats, with the bourgeoisie, who are representatives of those classes. And they come to realize that those people don't eat babies for breakfast. They're not evil. They are often intelligent. Sometimes they're more humane than some of their colleagues in their relations with their wives or their children or the people that are working for them in Parliament. So inevitably a certain degree of rapport develops between them and the people they're interacting with, who they're spending more time with than the workers that elected them. On top of that, they get so involved in the difficult process of getting reforms through Parliament that they find that having to rationalize and defend and explain every decision they make, and they're making 25 decisions a day. These are difficult alliances they have to strike in order to win a reduction in working hours from 12 hours to 10 hours as a piece of legislation. They have to trade things off. So in order to make their lives easier, they try to organize the party conference so that they can get that ratified without a lot of problems for them. Of course, there are also psychological reasons that are also material and objective. After you spent 5, 10 years as a representative of the party, living the life of a parliamentary representative, even if you've been kicking money back into the party, as the Social Democratic Party did. Anybody who was in Parliament had to give a good part of their salary back to the party. But do they want to go back to the mine? So they start using their position, their control over the party press, their control over when the conference will be held and what the agenda will be, to organize it in such a way to ensure they get re-elected as the representatives of the party. And then there's a psychological dimension. Remember, Michels is writing this at the time when popular psychology is just becoming very fashionable amongst intellectuals, Freudianism, etc. And he says there's also a psychological and organizational component on the side of the masses. The party leadership has organized the membership. And it's a remarkable thing. When you think about it, these parties and the mass unions that they created, and in the German case, it was the party that created the unions. Not like in the British case, where it was the unions that created the Labour Party. These organizations, they are the first permanent organizations of subordinate classes in human history. There have always been slave revolts. There have always been bread riots, usually led by women. But the first permanent organizations of subordinate classes were these mass working class organizations. So it's a remarkable thing in which the people at the base who organized, right, had a lot of political capacities, even if they remained miners and steel workers and bank workers and teachers, whatever. But these are not people who have had anybody speaking for them, championing their rights. So there develops a psychological hero worship of these people who are speaking for them, who are speaking for them so well, who are getting all of this national attention in their name. So a certain psychological deference for the leader develops, he argues. Right? And if you look at it, if you do any comparative analysis, the leaders of working class organizations, whether unions or parties, have a much longer lifespan in leadership than do the leaders of bourgeois organizations. They've always lasted longer in leadership. And it's not only because they've controlled the organization, it's also because of the attitude of the membership to them. The deference of the membership to them. So these two things together, these organizational factors, and these psychological factors, he says, explain why even working class parties that are the political agencies of democratization develop into oligarchies run by an elite. And he becomes one of those elite theorists who says that democracy is not possible. And if democracy is not possible, well then, of course, socialism, in any proper, humane sense of the word, is not possible. What does socialism mean? In the last 15 years, say the first 15 years of this century, in parallel with the 15 years that Michels was looking at when he wrote Political Parties in 1916. We have seen, especially amongst young people who have been political, who have been active, who have been outraged by capitalist globalization, we have seen a rejection of parties, a rejection of political organization. And why not? Given the experience with the great communist and social democratic parties through the course of the 20th century, indeed, by the 1960s, it was obvious that even in the sense of being able to change regimes, or in the sense to be able to win substantial reforms, both the communist parties and the social democratic parties had largely run their historical course. So we've seen, since the anti-globalization protests in the late 1990s, a certain anarchist zeitgeist, if I can use that word, a certain popular spirit of rejection of organization in the name of horizontalism, in the name of consensus politics, in the name of protest. And it got summed up by John Holloway, a Scottish Marxist who went to live in Mexico and became very close to the Zapatistas in Mexico. It got summed up in a phrase which he called, named the book, called "Changing the World Without Taking Power." And that was the kind of thing that, of course, you could see characterized the Occupy movement. Which was horizontalist, which involved, by example, showing that people could be sociable with one another in occupying a city square, could reproduce that occupation, could provide food and support and health care to one another, and engage in a protest. Right? But, and this was, of course, true of the long wave of protests we've seen against capitalism in this century already. It never yielded permanent organization. And it's like you start again with every protest. What is happening today, and what sees it everywhere, it's most prominent, if you like, in Greece, in Slovenia now, in Spain, with the fact that exactly this type of movement, the Indignados movement, which is based on occupying squares, has turned itself into a political organization, Podemos, which now is leading the polls in Spain. Yes, it's ahead of all the other parties. And it has just spent the whole of last month paying enormous attention to the details of what the party organization will be. How long a representative can stay a representative. They put a limit of 8 years. You cannot be either a party functionary or, if you get elected, a political representative for longer than 8 years, and then you have to go back into the party base. And they've tried to establish, as the Greens did in Germany in the 1970s, provisions for the recall of representatives, etc., and they're obviously thinking about what kinds of barriers can we put in place of the iron law of oligarchy. So we are at a turning point. We are at a turning point in which people who understand the chaos and irrationality, inequality, exploitation that global capitalism so obviously involves, are beginning again, as was done in the late 19th century, to try to create political organizations to go beyond capitalism. And the same issues arise. Will we win reforms that will add up eventually to a number of reforms, and suddenly we'll realize we'll be beyond capitalism? The Bernstein model, the social democratic model? Or others who take the view that we are building an organization that will somehow allow us to make a more radical break, a revolution, whether that involves violence or not, but a radical break. The same kinds of questions arise. And I'm sure you see this, you've seen it in Latin America even before the crisis of 2007, 2008, but you've seen it with the breakthrough of Syriza in Greece, just to the south, although that grows out of institution building of almost 3 decades, party building that previously was the grounds for it being laid since the 1980s. But you see it in Venezuela, you saw it in Ecuador, you saw it in Bolivia, where social movements turned themselves into political parties, successful political parties. Obviously, we have a lot to learn. There's every good reason for people to say, what's the point of doing this? It's already been proven a failure. And I'm not speaking of it now in the sense that the Bolshevik Revolution produced Stalinism, or that the social democratic parties eventually produced Blair. No, I'm speaking of it in a much more deeper and profound sense of what Michels was already identifying in 1916, so that it would have remained a problem with Lenin or Bukhara. And it was a problem even in the Swedish Social Democratic Party. The best of them. So how do we, if we are interested in overcoming the irrationality, the chaos, the inequality, the marginalizations, increasingly the xenophobia again, that capitalism throws up, What can we learn from the mistakes of the past? Not even sure we should call them mistakes. From the experience of the past, from the contradictions that such movements, such parties found themselves in the past. What can we learn? Lukács, in 1922, said that although there had been a great deal of writing about the Revolutionary Party, most of it was written about a technical problem. How can we become a better vanguard? How can we become more efficient cadre? Treat it as a technical question, rather than one of, as he put it, the greatest intellectual problem of socialist thought. Well, Lukács very famously failed to solve that problem, or even address it very usefully. Gramsci's greatest contribution, of course, was to try to think through that problem. And it was one of the tragedies of my intellectual experience that those very creative Marxist thinkers who tried to use Gramsci's notion of hegemony to address the question of reformulating socialist strategy, entirely concentrated on the mistaken ideas of this or that Marxist theorist. You know, most of us academics, we don't do much research. Especially if we're philosophers, we read other philosophers. So they sat down and they read Lenin and Kautsky and Bukharin and Stalin and Gramsci and Bernstein and whoever. And they identified something that they said or something in their thought that was the seed of Stalinism, or was the seed of social democratic revisionism and parliamentarism. See, if they hadn't thought that, this wouldn't have been the problem. Which is, of course, pure idealism. They spent no time, unlike Gramsci, actually examining the practices of these parties that I'm talking about. And why, what were the causes, the material causes, of them taking the path they did. And that's what we need to really do. The problem doesn't fundamentally lie in the inadequacies of this or that theorist. The problem lies in the difficulty of organizing ordinary working people who, in the nature of the capitalist system, are denied the capacity to rule their lives, denied the capacity to develop the skills, the confidence, the knowledge to change the world. I'm entirely in favor of turning the banks into public utilities, of having common ownership of the means of production. But if we're honest, and you discovered this in Yugoslavia because you went further along this road than anybody, the notion that ordinary people know what to do with financial derivatives, which is what today's financial system is based on, well, of course they don't know. The bankers themselves don't understand the derivative process. So to imagine what we're talking about as a transformation involves developing the types of organization which are concerned to develop the capacities of their members to run democratically a world, to democratically engage in the process of transforming the world. And why is that so hard to do? Why wasn't it done is the big question. After the 1848 uprisings, during which Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, Marx had some very sober reflections. You know, he had seen very clearly and put it in the manifesto that he says the first task of all working class political parties is to organize the proletariat into a class. There's no illusion there that workers are born with revolution in their genes, whether they're blue genes or their DNA. That the proletariat is not even a class in itself. Right? This is already too mechanical a notion. People don't automatically think of themselves as workers, let alone for themselves. They think of themselves as women, as Slovenians, as Catholics, as football enthusiasts, even if they're workers. So the first task is to be involved in getting people to identify in class terms, seeing that they can engage in a political relationship with one another that is solidaristic and one that is conflictual with those who are employing them, exploiting them, making decisions for them, etc. Of course, the manifesto was written in great haste for a revolutionary moment. The working classes were hardly organized in that moment. And by 1850, Marx organizes a split in the organization, the Communist League, which is where your League of Communists got its name, organizes a split, walks away from the organization with his side of it in London in 1850 because he says the majority of the group thinks that we have to make a revolution tomorrow. And if we can't make it immediately, then they're going to take to their beds. They might as well go to sleep. And he says, our view is that this is a 15, 20, 50-year process in which workers can develop their ability to confront capital and change the world. He was right. You know, exactly 150 years ago this year, he created the first international, arguing against the trade unions of that time, as they were called, the societies, that they were too craft-oriented, that they were too exclusionary of other workers, that what one needed was organizations that would organize the working class as a whole to engage in its complete emancipation. Very difficult to do. By a decade later, he gives up on the international. But by 1890, 1895, 10 years after his death, Engels is writing, we see the mass organization we were imagining in 1850. And we saw it. By that time, Australia already had a Labour government. It already won not only for working men, but even for working women, the right to vote. Of course, Australia was known as the trade union state. But you see these mass parties developing everywhere, as they did between 1880 and 1920. Their real problem is the ones that Michel's was getting at. Of course there were careerists in the Social Democratic Party. But that isn't the deep problem. That isn't the real problem. Of course, the failure of the German Revolution, which meant that socialism in one country was attempted in the Soviet Union, and perhaps, after Lenin's death, attempted by a psychopath in power. Of course, those are factors. They're historical contingencies. They're very important. But what Michel's was getting at were more fundamental material problems, which every working class organization, whether in a capitalist democracy or in a post-revolutionary communist context, has run up against. Every single one of them. And we can, at the beginning of the 21st century, where capitalism has penetrated every corner of the globe, where the Chinese Communist Party has become an agency of capitalist class formation, we can give up. Or we can say to ourselves, this has been an incredibly powerful and dynamic system, capitalism. Marx, like most people who wanted a different world, it was very understandable that they would hope that the system would come to an end in their own lifetimes, or at least in their children's lifetimes. But it was naive to think that such a powerful system, one which was really just beginning in 1850 to make the world in its own image, as we can now see, would run out of steam so quickly, and that working classes would develop the organizational means of transforming it so quickly. It's much more likely that that will only happen through many, many instances of trial and error. As it's been said, I think it was Beckett in one of his depressing plays, I forget which one, said, try, fail again, try, fail better, try again, fail better still. The real problems of the communist parties need to be understood, it seems to me, in terms of what Isaac Deutscher, at the end of the first volume of the 3-volume biography he wrote of Trotsky, which is one of the great pieces in socialist literature. And it's an education just to read those 3. I've never been a Trotskyist. That has nothing to do with it. At the end of the first volume, the Bolshevik Revolution has just happened. And he says, they confronted something that nobody who was a socialist thinker of any stripe previous to that had indicated that they would really realize would be a problem. Whatever branch of socialist thought. Everybody assumed that once the proletariat was won over to socialism, they would stay won over to socialism. What the Bolsheviks discovered in 1918, 1919, was that wasn't the case. That the working classes had been involved in the making of the revolution, although they were a minority in the uprisings. But if they left opposition parties, and if they left free trade unions, workers were likely to vote for those opposition parties. And the unions were likely to make demands which would make the introduction of the types of transformations that the Bolsheviks were trying to do very difficult. So those enormous debates that tortured the Bolsheviks through 1919 and 1920 were really debates about, can we hold on to power against the working class when the working class is no longer socialist? And Deutscher says, the way that was resolved, remember, this is before Lenin died, with the banning of opposition parties, right? With the turning of trade unions into agencies of the party and of managers. He says, at very best, what happened was a dictatorship that ruled in the name of the class, but not the class itself. Now, this is not to say that even so, the communist parties, including the communist parties outside of Russia, outside of the Soviet Union, even in the West, who slavishly followed Stalin's lines, which, at least to Tito's credit, he refused to do by the late 1940s. That is not to say that some of the role that communist parties have always played so well, they did not continue to play. They did develop out of the working classes, out of ordinary working people, intelligent, educated organizers, cadre. They did. People who were committed to organizing, building the power and capacities of other workers. They did develop their understanding of how capitalism works as a system. I come from a working class family. My parents worked in sweatshops. My father was a social democrat, a trade unionist, a reformist, one of the founders of the Canadian Social Democratic Party in the city in which he lived. Very critical of the Soviet Union, of the Hitler-Stalin pact, etc. My aunt, my mother's sister, was a communist. And even though I was born in 1945, my childhood was full of arguments between my aunt and my father over the Hitler-Stalin pact in 1939. But I have to say that although my father had, I think, a much greater sensibility of the limits of the Soviet Union, I was always impressed with the fact that my aunt understood the theory of surplus value. When I said to her, as she was elderly, how are you doing financially? She said, I'm better off than I've ever been. I get my pension now. I'm better off than I've ever been. She said, but don't get me wrong. I know they only give you enough to make sure that you go back to work the next day, which is a basic Marxist understanding of the reproduction of classes. Communist parties, no matter how abject they were, continued to play that kind of role with their membership, educating them in how capitalism worked, what their place within it was, developing their capacities in that sense. They didn't do that alone. Social democratic parties did it as well. My father could run a meeting. He had a grade 4 education. He understood, I don't know if you know here, what Robert's Rules of Order are. They're the British agenda for how to run a meeting without it being chaos. He understood this better from having been active in his local party branch and trade union branch than do my undergraduate students in political science. He had a better understanding of politics than they do, which he also got out of the Social Democratic Party. So they too, to some extent, performed that function, even if not as Marxist and deep a one. Yet at the same time, in a way very different from the Communist parties, just as Michel's so clearly understood by 1916, their leaderships became entirely enframed within parliamentarism. Their leaders became permanent elected representatives. People built careers from the time they came out of high school or university, or from the time they became a trade union staff person. They would build a career as a parliamentary representative, the way you would build a career as a lawyer or a social worker. That's what those parties became. It's not to say they didn't win reforms over time, but as I said before, by the 1960s, and this was true even of the French Communist Party, it was true of the Italian Communist Party, it was true of the Swedish Social Democratic Party, it was true of the British Labour Party. All of those parties lost the capacity to educate and organize working people. They largely lost the interest in doing so. Partly that had to do with media and television. They could now reach people through advertising on television. They didn't need the active party base. And there were debates in all of them. Why are we bothering with these party organizations that we have to spend our time going to and meeting with and explaining what we do to? Let's spend all of our money on television ads in election campaigns. And their party bases began to atrophy, to decline. And inevitably over time, of course, given that there wasn't even a party base that they had to at least justify themselves to, those parties ended up. Now the Italian Communist Party is to the right of the American Democratic Party. Or they ended up with Blair. So what of the new parties? I have no idea how long I've been talking. Another 10, 15 minutes? Now I'm coming to the hard part. It's easy to talk about the past. There have been many, well, maybe not many, but very significant attempts to learn from this experience and to go beyond it. So far, the news is not so good. In Brazil, the dictatorship was brought down by a remarkable combination and alliance between automobile workers, and the Catholic Church. Radical priests, liberation theologists in the Catholic Church, and ordinary workers like Lula. And they organized a strike against General Motors in Brazil in the late 1970s under the dictatorship, where they had picket lines not outside the factories, where the military could come and pick them up. But they had the picket lines at the bus stops in the favelas, in the shanty towns, in the hills. Right? And that's where they did it with the help of the church in each community. And that's how the strike succeeded. Out of that mobilization, which brought down the Brazilian military, grew the Brazilian Workers' Party. And the trade union that was its ally, the CUT, and eventually the Landless People's Movement, which was the most powerful of the movements that grew along with it, occupying unused land and turning it into productive land by landless farmers, landless peasants. And that party was very explicitly a post-Leninist and post-parliamentarist party. It explicitly said, we are organizing cadre. When we get elected into the state, and realistically, there was no other way to get into the state except to build a mass organization and get elected and get into the state. When we get into the state, we will continue to be organizing cadre. Our main role will be from inside the state to continue to organize the unorganized. Continue to allow people who are unorganized to empower themselves. Indeed, we'll use state resources to do that. They explicitly had that as their notion. Today, the Workers' Party of Brazil is a classical social democratic parliamentarist party. I mean, you can say there are more progressive things about its program, the Bolsa Familia that it's given to poor people, or more reactionary things about its program, the way Lula has been ambassador for Brazilian multinational corporations, not only in Latin America, but in Africa, etc. That's not the point. It has become indistinguishable from the Labour Party, from the French Socialist Party, as an organization. How did that happen? Why did that happen? And you could already see it happening in two respects. From the time they started electing mayors in the Brazilian cities, long before Lula was elected as president at the beginning of the 2000s. They elected their first mayors in 1987, 88, 89. You could already see it happening. Why? Here again, it's not because these people are, I don't know if you know the word shysters. You know, they talk a good line, but they really don't mean it. They're careerists, they're opportunists, or they're evil vanguardists. They're psychopathic Leninists. No, that's not the problem. The problem is this. And I know from some conversations that some of your own people who are engaged in the new politics are already facing this. You elect a mayor in a big city like Porto Alegre or Belo Horizonte, where they were very strong. You know, we don't go to Brazil very much. It's a massive country. There are cities we've never heard of that are bigger than Toronto, which is 4 or 5 million people. So they elect a mayor. And one of the first things he actually does is he creates, in the favelas, an institution that allow people who live in the favelas to make decisions with real resources given over to them about whether they will have a school or a sewer or a road to improve their favela. And you find uneducated black women making decisions of this kind with a portion of the budget that is passed over to them. Remarkable achievement, the famous participatory budget. You also find, however, that the guy who becomes mayor doesn't have enough hours a day just to administer the city. And he's expected on the kind of image that the party has built for itself to be not only doing that, but to be educating and developing these black women in the favelas to be able to take the class struggle even further. And he finds that he doesn't have enough day even to, and let alone eat. Even his staff don't have enough time. One of the reasons they don't have enough time is that as soon as you put a sewer into a shanty town, into a favela is built on a piece of land owned by a landowner, which under Brazilian law says if it's not being used for agricultural purposes, it can be occupied because it's not being productive. This was actually passed by the military. Well, as soon as you put a sewer on that land and you stop the runoff of the water, you find that the landlord comes along and he says, this is now productive land. He still has property ownership in that land. I want this land back, or I want compensation for this land, which would bankrupt the city if they have to pay him off. So the very good thing they did produces a class struggle. Right? It takes the struggle to another level. And what the Workers' Party did not do, what it was afraid to do, what it would overwhelm the time of the leadership to do, was to develop the capacities of those black uneducated women to engage in any strategic discussions around what to do about these larger questions. They left them with the 1,000 reales that they could decide to spend on this or that. But on any of the strategic decisions about program, about class struggle, even about tactics, this was done, and you can understand why it was done, in the small group around the mayor, who were already overwhelmed, and the thought that they would have to involve all these other people in making these decisions seemed inconceivable to me. Now that's only a small example of what is an everyday problem. An everyday problem in a political organization that is both trying to represent people, their immediate needs, build them reforms that they need today, but also develop people's capacities and develop the organization's capacities, the party's capacity to change the world in a democratic way. That's just a small example. A small example. I confronted it again in 1994 in a little different context. I was invited to El Salvador after the FMLN turned itself from a guerrilla army, because there had been a civil war in El Salvador from the early 80s until then. It turned itself into a political party after the peace agreement was signed. And they, as they were turning themselves into a political party, they sponsored their first party educational program. And I was invited to run that program, and it was not run very well. It was run like an election campaign. I was driven from one city to another in meetings like this, and I had to try to run an educational program to people who didn't speak English at all. So I would say a word, and someone else would translate for a word. You can't run an educational program like this. That wasn't what I wanted to tell you. I met with a man called Facundo Guardado, who was the subcomandante on the San Salvador volcano during the war. And he eventually became the candidate for the president in 1999, but this was 1994. And he said, the trouble with the party right now, is we're just beginning to build it, is that people think that the long run is the next election. In fact, the next election, which will be in 4 or 5 years, is the short run. We have to hope that by the time of the next election, we have a strong enough membership base, enough resources, that we can become a significant political force in the country. The medium term is 2010, where we have to hope that we have enough presence as a political force in the country, with enough capacity in the party, to be able to win from the outside of the state some reforms. And then the long term is 2020, when we have to hope to be able to get into government and really be able to do something to change the society. And the woman who was running the educational school, Angela Zamora, said, in that case, I'm leaving the party. I can't go back to the people who've been fighting in a civil war for 15 years and tell them they need to wait till 2010 for any reforms, or to 2020 until they have any chance of seeing socialism. I can't do this. And you see there the tension. They both were right. They both are right. So, what is to be done, to coin a phrase? In Latin America, Chavez and Morales have been somewhat conscious of this. Although in both cases, rather tragically, the great support of the masses was built to some extent through hero worship, through the identification of a great leader who did it, both amazing capacities, charisma, leadership ability, vision, and so on, discipline. But nevertheless, the concentration of the capacity of the party in one person, the vision of the party in one person, is obviously a recipe for disaster. They haven't been unaware of this, and Chavez created the PSUP, a new mass socialist party, which was designed precisely to create the basis for overcoming this, to develop people's capacities. It hasn't happened. And the party has in fact been used, and was used by him, more as a means of controlling the activists than as a means of developing their capacities. In Bolivia, the tragedy has been somewhat different, and that is that the most capable people from the social movement, it was a rural indigenous people's movement that created the party and put them into the state, that all of the activists have been drawn into the state. And insofar as there's nobody with capacities left outside the state, there's little ability to further organize, there's little ability to challenge the decisions made, etc., which is the case in Bolivia. Syriza is facing this now in Greece. Syriza could not have made the breakthrough it did just on the basis of Tsipras having the courage to say, we intend to go into, as he said in the run-up to the 2012 election, we intend to go into government, we intend to form a government coalition, and we intend to stop the Greek people being raped by the ECB and the IMF and Brussels. It would be immoral for us just to say we're running in this election just to be a minority, just to oppose. And that's what brought Syriza to the edge of power. Just that. Until then, they were running below 10% in the opinion polls. But that couldn't have happened without 20, 30 years of party building. And without the insertion of that party, which came out of the Communist Party. It was a European wing, a democratic wing of the Communist Party. Without the insertion of that party in a very, very creative and disciplined way into the social movements, into the student movement, into the movement, into the pro-refugee movement in Greece in the previous years, the previous decade before that happened. What Syriza has accomplished is very impressive, and it isn't just parliamentarism. They also have their members now who are in parliament giving back a good part of their salaries to the solidarity networks that exist in every Greek city. Those solidarity networks distribute food, they distribute pharmaceuticals. Now that you can't afford pharmaceuticals any longer in Greece, since the subsidies have been removed. And it's they give their salaries to that, and it's the Syriza leadership in each local area that is the most active element in those solidarity networks. This is not just a parliamentarist thing that Syriza is engaged in. But they are finding it very, very hard to be able to take the people they contact in the squares, in the solidarity networks, into the party. They go into a party branch meeting, they find some, we were laughing at this before, some intellectual who wants to discuss Heidegger. Or they find some debate of whether they should or shouldn't leave the euro, conducted in abstract terms. And they're ashamed to bring them to a party meeting. So who's joining the party are the old PASOK careerists. Now that the PASOK, the party that preceded them, the Social Democratic Party that was so clientelist and corrupt, etc., has lost its base, and many of their members are flocking into Syriza. A greater problem is, and one you will eventually have to confront, they will certainly confront soon. Of course, what's been done to Greece is horrific. Of course, the Greek ship owners, who as soon as the junta came into power in 1967, were removed from having to pay taxes, which is true to this day. That was the first act the junta passed. It removed any taxes on the Greek ship owners, who are, of course, the basis of the Greek bourgeoisie. Well, they took their money out immediately. There was no capital controls to prevent them. They put it in Swiss and London banks if they didn't have already them there. And now they're coming back and they're buying things up, now that they've been devalued. All that said, it was true that the Greek state is clientelist, patronage-ridden, corrupt, inefficient. And Syriza has been very honest about saying so. It's not just the IMF that says so. It's not just the ECB that says so. Not just Angela Merkel that says so. It's true. So if Syriza takes its 10,000 most capable activists and puts them into the state when it gets elected, takes its best teachers and puts them into the Department of Education, takes its best economists who do understand derivatives, and puts them into the socialized banks. Who will be left in the party to organize, to educate, to challenge the decisions being made by the parliamentarians? This is the real crisis Syriza faces. I don't have an answer to this. Barriers can be created, Podemos is discussing them, to prevent the types of organizational and psychological blockages that Michel's identified. I'm sure that party organizations will build such barriers in the 21st century, but that obviously isn't enough. I think what we have to recognize, and it's a major recognition, is that the type of political organization capable of turning the proletariat into a class, in the sense of a mass of ordinary people with the desire and the ability to do away with classes, to develop a full human being. The type of party that knows how to do that, that is capable of doing it, has yet to be invented. So I only want to end with this. What you have embarked on in the last year, and it may seem like a very small step, and it is, and you're one of the few places in the world that's embarking on it yet, although it's going to happen again and again and again in the 21st century. It's inevitable. What you've embarked on puts a very heavy burden of responsibility on you. To try to make some contribution to that invention. We're engaged in a process of not just elections, not just putting forward reforms, but we're engaged in a process of knowledge creation, an active process of knowledge creation. And a lot of people are going to be watching you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leo. I am convinced that there are many questions, comments, and other contributions. And just please raise your hand. The floor is open for you.
This better be not like that meeting in Kumrovich. After I finished speaking in Kumrovich, the 300 suits there were dead silent. Dead silent. And the man who introduced me was embarrassed. They had been training all of these apparatchiks afterwards. And no one was going to ask a question. He said, somebody must ask a question. So one guy at the back picked up his hand. He said, your name is Panitch, so you must be Yugoslav. Actually, my grandfather came to Canada before World War I from the southern Ukraine near the Moldovan border. But you must be Yugoslav. What would you do if you were Prime Minister of our country? And I thought inside my head, I can only think of one word: resign.
Okay, perhaps a question or a comment from the audience. Then maybe a short question for you. We have seen that, especially, let's say, in the case of Podemos, but also in the case of Syriza and the United Left, these parties have entered the state, right? And you said that there are many quite objective reasons that the party cannot reproduce its mass support anymore. What would you say was then what would you say would be in a way the right strategy for the left by entering the the state, because let's say in the current conjuncture, it is perhaps even harder to organize the working classes in the community or in the factory than trying to make some kind of a political breakthrough and enter the parliament. So what would be your thoughts on that?
It's very difficult to give a general recipe for this. I think obviously, even if you have a conception that what you're engaged in is a, as Marx said, 15, 20, 50-year process of institution building, you can't win people over to you without offering them the ability to help them in their lives today, tomorrow. They want to hear that you can win some immediate reforms. In that sense, the fact that you so quickly elected people into Parliament and are a visible voice on the political terrain of the country, I think gives you the ability to talk to ordinary people in a way that socialist groups who don't have parliamentary representation aren't able to. Because a socialist can come along and say, you know, here's all of the reasons to be against capitalism, and here why we really need to develop the abilities to get by it. And an ordinary person would say, yes, you're right, I can see that, but I've got cockroaches in my public housing building. The plumbing is not working, or they're about to close down our power plant, or they're about to privatize our bank and introduce flexible labor, or reduce the workforce, or take away our pensions, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you have a tremendous opportunity because you're able to speak to people through the media, and because once you're in Parliament, you're obliged, necessarily obliged, to be addressing immediate reforms, immediate policies. That's what parliaments do. The danger would be that you do that without taking advantage of the situation you're in. That is, substituting yourself for ordinary people. We will do it for you by raising these questions. In fact, you won't do it as well. You won't know what to do as well. You won't be able to see what compromises you should make, what reforms you should push for, if you aren't putting even more energy, more of your time, more of your abilities into organizing those people into your extra-parliamentary organizations. Whether those are aligned union branches or better, any party mass branches you have. And that doesn't have to involve masses of people. It can involve 2-3 people who are leaders in their school. I mean, leaders in the sense the people in the school that people naturally look up to amongst the teachers. And every workplace has, and they don't even have to be leftist, has those types of people, the people who seem to be able to gain the trust of their fellow workers. And to be able to get those people on side, to learn from them, to help them build local bases for your parliamentary organization is the most important thing you can do, I think. Now, the trouble is that I know that your parliamentarians and their staff are already running around like chickens without their heads on, with not enough hours a day to deal just with the parliamentary issues. So the problem becomes, where do you get the resources? Where do you get the time to do this other stuff? Right? We were talking about this earlier. And this is, I think, the oldest and most difficult problem. If you don't address it immediately, if you don't address it now, then all of the Michelsian things that I was describing in the iron law of oligarchy, all of the problems both with Communist Party vanguardism And all of the problems with social democratic parliamentarism will begin to sediment themselves at a very early stage. Okay? So I think that's what I would say to that question. But it's very general. It can't speak to the specific situation.
Okay, perhaps now we have any comment, question?
Yes, I see a hand in the back.
Thank you. I have a question concerning the topic of reinventing state. Doesn't this mean that we more than ever need a strong theory of what a state is?
Yes.
And isn't it perhaps a good example or a good strategy how to form it to go to some other thinker than Marx?
Yes.
And I don't mean Plato, I mean Hegel, because, for example, Hegel has everything. He has state regulating the market. He has, all the.
Yeah.
He somehow thought about how to make a social state and so on. So this would be the question.
It's a very good question. Sure, I think that we should go to Weber. I think we can go to all kinds of places, but and I think you're pointing to something very important that I've written about a lot and worried about a lot, and that is that one of the weakest areas of historical materialism has been its theory of the state. Until the 1960s, it really didn't go beyond the manifesto statement that the modern state was the device, the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, the device that the bourgeoisie used to control modern society. And that reductionism of the state to direct bourgeois control has remained a central problem of Marxism. Some advances were made, including by my mentor Ralph Miliband, in the 1960s and 70s. And he insisted that you needed to make a distinction between class power and state power. That you can't simply see the state as a field of class control, class representation, as the French structuralists used to say, a condensation of class forces. States are distinctive institutions. They are dependent on, at their capitalist states, and we should be clear that Marxism only has a theory of a capitalist state. One of its greater weaknesses was what the hell was Marxism's theory of the Soviet state? What was it in Marxist terms? Objectively, I don't mean in terms of propaganda. But of the capitalist state, Marxism's theory was very weak. And although the capitalist state is dependent on capital accumulation, it's dependent on successful capital accumulation for its own tax revenues. It's dependent on capital accumulation for its legitimacy. If there is high unemployment, governments don't get elected, civil servants don't get home at night to see their children because there are riots in the streets, etc. Right? So it's a capitalist state in the sense that it is dependent on capitalism. Right? And all of its institutions over time, and Hegel had no understanding of this. How could he? All of its institutions over time, over the last 2 centuries, slowly, incrementally, get organized in such a way that they do not test the limits of capital, or they're actively engaged in promoting capital accumulation. So the type of education we have is more or less oriented to producing the types of workers that capital needs. more or less, not completely, it's relatively autonomous, but more or less. Right? The type of welfare we have, the type of social welfare we have, the type of unemployment insurance, the type of pensions we have, are structured in such a way as not to undermine the capitalist labor market. So not too many people, right, will not want or not have to sell their labor for a wage. Right? And Hegel didn't understand that. And then Hegel had another problem, which he thought that the civil servant could be the agency of universal humanity. Because it's true, the state, unlike a capitalist, does have to take the interests of the society as a whole into account. It has to keep the society together. That's what civil servants, politicians need to do. They need to formulate policies for the whole society. Right? Marxists haven't paid enough attention, however, to the way in which state institutions are specifically organized and differentiated in ways very different from capitalist institutions in doing these things. And even if businessmen get into the state, they don't act there as capitalists. They act there as civil servants, in which they have the responsibility of having to reproduce capitalism, which is not the same thing as making profit for this or that company. Right? They may have closer ties with business, they may be influenced by them, of course they may be corrupt, etc., etc. So whether it's civil servants, whether it's capitalists, they can't avoid unintended consequences. Now, capitalist doesn't have to think about it unless the state forces him to. He builds a mine here, it causes pollution in this river. The water from that river goes down into a natural bath where the town is dependent on tourism to come sit in that natural warm mineral bath. This is Ibsen's Enemy of the People I'm talking about. Well, the mine owner doesn't have to worry about this. Right? But the civil servant, the mayor, even if he's elected with capitalist money, etc., he has to handle this problem, this contradiction. Right? Every civil servant has to handle it, has to deal with it somehow. So it's a different set of responsibilities, it's a different set of institutions. In terms of transformation, the stupidest concept in Marxism was the notion of smashing the state. What does it mean? You take a hammer and you go to the building and you knock it down? What did it mean? It comes out of the argument with the anarchists. Changing the world without taking power. And one understands why people are anarchists. States are oppressive. Of course. In class societies, they reproduce class oppression. Of course. Right? They keep law and order. One understands that. But you can't, Marx said to Bakunin, I mean the withering away of the state only in the sense of an agency of domination. Right? I don't mean it in the sense of public institutions where you have accountable representatives making the very difficult decisions of what's to be invested, how it's to be invested, what's to be produced, how it's to be produced. That's what socialism will be about. And just think of all of the negotiations involved, right? In deciding to, in a country like mine, in deciding to do that between the fishermen in Vancouver and workers in Windsor on the other side of the continent. You need all kinds of layers of complex representation and decision-making of the most possible democratic kind to do this. So you really need to pay attention to what would be the public institutions of a socialist society. And it's not good enough to say, well, we'll also have workers' control at the level of the factories. Even worse if you say they'll discipline each other by being competitive with one another, right, in a market. So they'll be concerned with taking business away from the other group of workers who they're competing with. This should be familiar to you. So the difficult then question becomes, how do you transform the institutions which are now structured to reproduce capitalism, because they're dependent on capital accumulation, not because capitalism tells them what to do. How do you begin to restructure institutions so that they are oriented to being arenas of democratic decision-making at every level? And this is very difficult. But one can start thinking this through. One would hope that public sector trade unions, the trade unions of public employees, would be addressing themselves to this question. You know, right now, most states, even in the West, I assure you, let alone in what you knew in communist Yugoslavia and much, much more if you lived anywhere else in Eastern Europe, most states are organized really like military apparatuses. Orders are given down in a chain of command, in a department, in an agency. If you want to talk to somebody about what do you think the policy should be, if you're at the middle level or at the bottom of this chain of command, and you talk to somebody equal to you in the department without going through the person above you, you will get a demerit on your file. The union may then defend you for getting that demerit on your file, but the union never has any ambition, any conception of challenging that form of organization inside the state. Why are people in the Department of Health, who are employed there as civil servants, social workers, why is it not their responsibility to go into the nursing homes and talk to the people in the nursing homes about, we have 3 different kinds of policies being debated in Parliament now for nursing homes, for the elderly. Why isn't it their responsibility to go into those nursing homes and talk to those people about which plan they think is better? Why is it their responsibility to go talk to the nurses and the cleaners in those nursing homes about what they think would be better? Even if you didn't make it so that the parliamentarians had to adopt whatever came out of that, it at least would have some democratic impetus. But in fact, today, of course, it is something that is prohibited. And moreover, it's something that's beyond the conception of social democratic parties or trade union leaders to even begin to conceive. So those are the kinds of examples I think that one can start thinking about. Of course, if you're engaged in a more radical break, you can do much more radical things. So when I talk about the importance of socializing the banks, and I fervently hope you won't allow the one advantage Slovenia has got, that the banks are still state-owned for the most part, or those that weren't state-owned are once again state-owned. For God's sake, don't give them away. But change their function. Change what they do in society. How can we possibly solve the ecological crisis? Even in a small country like this, let alone more generally, unless we have the capacity to take what passes through the banking system and have some degree of control over what gets invested in producing what type of sustainable goods. It's inconceivable. It's inconceivable. But you can't imagine you would take the banks as they're now structured, even the trade union bank as it's now structured, with the types of responsibilities that the people in it now have, and expect it to do anything different. You would have to find the means of changing its purpose, its mode of organization, its form of organization, and so on. This may sound difficult to do, but it is what we're talking about if we're going to affect a change in the state. Now, I don't think Hegel gives us this, although I think Hegel has certain insights. Do you think Hegel gives us this? Really?
Yes, to some extent, he was aware of the beast of capitalism that,
Yes.
that was going on around in England and other European countries. So there are some how should I say, he anticipated that, like, from the state, we need some social state, we need some
Yeah,
social institution.
at that very general level.
Yes, of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah, I mean, if anything you can get out of him that would help, we should take.
Okay. Perhaps any other questions or comments?
Hello, thanks for the lecture. I have a somewhat less abstract question about the traditional social democrat parties, which is that every time some kind of left-off, center-left party starts to gain leverage, I would imagine that this creates a burden on the Social Democrat Party in a sense of we should be mindful about the drifting forward further to the center, which means we have to somewhat change tactics, at least in rhetorics, if not in policy and politics. I think this happened. PASOK, I believe, was such a story, a combination of Keynesian policy and very radical rhetorics. And well, and it happened in some other cases as well. And it's actually a very interesting dilemma, as you stated, for the emergent party, which ends up in sort of a no man's land between selling out your ideals and not achieving major gains as the junior coalition partner. And these kinds of things were problems, whereas, I mean, it happened, like, I don't know, in Scandinavia, with the predecessors of Syriza, and on the regional level, in East Germany, France, and so on. Okay, this was the description. My question is this. Well, I have the impression that this is not happening currently. The German Social Democrats don't want to go nowhere near the Linke. The British Labour Party hasn't got a clue about what kind of meltdown the Scottish referendum is meaning to them. I mean, what is this? Is the emergent left not yet big enough of a threat, or is something different in the tactics of the traditional social democrat parties?
It's a very good question. I think the description is right. I think it may be because this couldn't go on forever. And the effect of pretending to cover your left flank but not actually doing anything. Even worse, pretending to cover your left flank and then when you get in government actually being neoliberal. Which has been the case in Scandinavia as well. I think has had the effect of undermining, marginalizing the party base, hollowing out those parties. And what appears to be happening to the social democratic parties, great social democratic parties in Europe, and it may even happen to the old bourgeois parties too, it appears, but certainly those, is exactly that they are losing their mass membership, all of them. They are losing the turnout from working class voters who either are voting for xenophobic, far-right parties or not voting. The effect of repeatedly doing this is actually having the effect of balkanizing the political system. In most places, the result is the balkanization is taking the form of populist right-wing parties. Very few cases still yet anything that we could say are fascist ones, but sometimes certainly racist ones, xenophobic ones, that are filling the space. And this is even happening to the French Communist Party, let alone the French Socialist Party, with the National Front in France. And that's why it's become so great a responsibility to have left parties which are able to speak to working people in a way that explains their difficulties and puts forward answers to them, that doesn't involve identifying the other, the quote-unquote other, as their problem, that doesn't identify labor mobility within the European community as their problem, rather than the mobility of capital in the European community, which is the fundamental problem, the inability to control what happens to investment. Another factor in all of this is that I don't think that the tacking to the left when a force emerges is just a product of cynicism. I think we need to stop looking at it that way. I think it's also because those parties always contain socialists, or at least people who do have a real contact with the problems of the people who vote for social democratic parties. You know, these parties may not be socialist parties, but they always contain socialists. And insofar as those people are marginalized, insofar as the party branches no longer have any life in them, insofar as they themselves get tired of this cycle you're describing, there are fewer socialists who have any voice in those parties. And that too is a factor that I think leads them not to tack in this direction. So I think that this is a really positive and important development. In the case of Miliband, I've just come from England and I watched this very closely. He actually was elected by the trade union, active trade unionists in the party, not by the parliamentarians, against Blairism. And he has wanted and tried to set a different path, but he is surrounded in the parliamentary party by Blairites. And every time he opens his mouth to say something radical, his standing in the opinion polls goes up, even though the media attacks him, you know, for what he looks like when he's eating a sandwich or whatever. But they attack him. But his parliamentarians immediately start whispering to the media. Right? They start leaking into the public urinal in ways that cause problems for him when he tacks to the left. And then he has no capacity sitting inside Parliament, dealing with these problems every day in Parliament, and being himself oriented and being good at debating inside Parliament. He has no capacity to bring back to life the empty, dead party branches of the Labour Party. You know, he's just done something that a lot of people on the left think is reactionary in Britain. The trade unions from the beginning in Britain, since they created the party, have supported the party financially by automatically designating the bulk of their membership as Labour Party members without asking their members. So the big unions affiliate 1 million members to the Labour Party. But these are paper members. All they are is the basis of getting money to the party. So Miliband, partly because the Blairites don't want the association with the unions, he instituted a thing whereby people actually have to sign up as members of the Labour Party. And he has said, I'd rather have 300,000 active trade unionists in the Labour Party than 3 million paper members. And he's right, obviously. The trouble is, the party branches down at the base don't have the capacity to make 300,000 active trade unionists in the Labour Party. This involves a task of organizing, inspiring at every local level. And they have no such capacity. So the worst of both worlds is going to happen. They won't get the trade union money, and they won't have the activists. This too supports the kind of thing you're saying. So I think there's all kinds of space now for a sane, creative, inventive left, which is conscious and aware of the problems that communist parties experience and created for themselves, is conscious and aware of all of the limitations of social democracy, to be able to step forward and try again. I really think this is an incredibly positive moment for the reason that you're identifying.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else?
Do you think any country in Europe, for example, or...
I don't see the speaker. Where are you? Okay, sorry.
Do you think any country in Europe or in world now, that very globalized world, can even make any significant left turn, without being attacked from outside?
Yeah, this is the big question. First of all, that's the right question to pose, but the way to get at answering it is to recognize that those people who say that states can't do anything because capital is global, because markets are global, that states have been weakened by capital, that states have been bypassed by capital, are wrong. Globalization is authored by states. It's not corporations who signed free trade agreements. It was not corporations who made the provisions of what is now a capitalist European Union, despite the hopes of so many socialists that it would be a socialist European Union. It's states that do this. So then the question becomes, why do states do this? But there's no sense thinking that states have been disempowered. They have as much power as ever. Sure, they've shifted some of that power. More of their orientation now, more of their policies are oriented to promoting competitiveness, market competitiveness, than it is for social welfare. So if you were a civil servant working in a Department of Labor, you would have gone into a cabinet meeting and said, the reason we need to pay higher wages is because if we don't, there will be a social disruption. That's why we need to pay attention to unions. Or the reason that we need to have policies to bring women into the labor force is because otherwise the feminists will be demonstrating next week. And it'll cause legitimacy problems for us. Now, if you're a social worker or a civil servant in the Department of Labor, you go into a cabinet meeting and you want to get more resources for yourself. You say, I have an idea to establish a training program where we will be able to train women workers in Slovenia on the average wage that will be able to become so productive they'll be able to compete with Vietnamese women who are working on $1 an hour. So they shift what they are saying in the cabinet meeting, still speaking for workers, in a way that's oriented to promoting international competitiveness, the discipline of competitiveness. Yes? Their goal not becomes more equality, not more rights for women, it becomes competitiveness. But the state remains powerful, even in such arenas as that, let alone in other arenas. So states haven't gone away. But there are states and states. If we were talking about a socialist party getting elected in the United States, don't laugh, it would be able to do things about globalization that no other state in the world could do. For Syriza to get in Greece, what could it do? Well, it could do some things immediately, and it could get away with doing them, and it wouldn't even cost that much. It could renege on all of the agreements, the memoranda. Really, in a way by now, since the European banks have written off the Greek debt anyway, they could get away with it and it wouldn't cost very much. They would reinstall the number of teachers in the schools. They would reinstall the programs where people get pharmaceuticals, get drugs in the drugstores, etc. This wouldn't even cost that much. But if they did socialize the banks, if they did introduce capital controls, and if for that they got kicked out of the Eurozone, this could mean that the situation of the Greek people would be even worse than it's been for the last 5 years. You can't run cars or factories on all of them. They have to be able to import all kinds of things. Yes, going back to the drachma, but even then, they no longer have the ability to print the drachma. They would have to find some place to print drachmas. They're not printable inside Greece anymore. The IMF has a plan for this, by the way, but I don't think Syriza does. The IMF have a plan B in case this happens. And they want to help them because they're afraid that if there's all kinds of Greek businessmen that can't pay the contracts that they've signed, they no longer have the euro, they need to have the drachma. The IMF is actually worried about this. So they have a plan B of how to organize this. I don't think Syriza has worked it out. So that then would be a problem. And the Greek people could even be worse out. But that's even apart from the fact that the Greeks, I imagine the Slovenians as well, in their great majority for good reason, don't want to be kicked out of the euro. Right? And Syriza wouldn't be where it is if they had said what we're proposing involves going out of the euro. They never would have had the kind of support that they have. Their argument has been that they'll let us do it. Right? Rather than kick us out, see a default on the debt, have us introduce capital controls, which could involve Spain doing it and Portugal doing it, and then it becomes something that can't be controlled. And the Americans have been very, very worried about this, and very angry with the Germans for not taking responsibility in that respect. Very angry with the Germans, putting a lot of pressure on them. And I think Syriza still hopes that even under a Republican administration, the Americans will put pressure on the Germans not to do it. But what it really shows is that we're back to 1917, tragically. Maybe this time it's farce, given that it's Greece rather than a massive country like the Soviet Union. But, you know, in order for Syriza to have the room it needs, to be able to do the things that it really does want to do, including changing the state the way I'm speaking, which it does, including socializing the banks in the way that I've been talking about, which it does. In order for it to have the room to do that, there would have to be a change in the balance of forces in the large northern European countries. Not a revolution in Germany, but at least a change in the balance of forces in Germany. The Social Democrats would not have to be so bloody neoliberal, right? So competitive as they are. Not only in Germany, the Scandinavians are the worst. You know, everybody looks up to Scandinavian social democracy. They've been the worst in putting the squeeze on the peripheral states of Southern Europe. So there'd have to be a shift in the balance of forces there. And there you come to international solidarity. And what are the possibilities of that? What are the responsibilities for that? And, you know, we do come back to the question of you can't change the world in one country alone. What one has to hope is that examples and struggles of the kind that are taking place in Greece and Spain, examples of creating new institutions with new possibilities of actually getting elected, actually building a base, keeping support, etc., will have an effect to open space for class struggle of this creative kind in other countries, which will have an effect on the balance of class forces. That's what we have to hope will happen. And in that sense, the worst kind of international solidarity is the kind that goes to Brazil and sees the participatory budgets. And everybody, they did it. They took them around to every favela and showed them, isn't this wonderful, look what they're doing, and so on. But they didn't show them any of the limits of the type I was describing. Right? And then you come back and say, oh, the Brazilians have figured it out. Right? That's the model. or Chavez is the model. It's a bit like when the British Fabians, who weren't very revolutionary, went to the Soviet Union in 1935. Just as the show trials are coming to their peak, they came back to England because it had full employment. And they said, I've seen the future and it works. That's the worst international solidarity. When I go back to Canada, from the conversations I had with people in the United Left and what they're doing in Parliament, I'm going to talk to my comrades about the difficulties I heard about today. The contradictions they're facing. Because that's how you really learn. You don't learn because they tell you everything's hunky-dory. That's always bullshit. You know, pardon the expression. It's always misleading. Right? What we're trying to do is very hard. So the worst kind of international solidarity is the kind that goes off and sees the Zapatistas and comes back and says they're fantastic. They're the most democratic thing in the world. And you don't even think for a minute, but they're a guerrilla army. How can they be democratic? Armies aren't democratic by their nature. So you need the kind of solidarity in which you're helping people understand the problems you're having and what you're trying to do, so that they can, in their own situation, anticipate those problems and try to learn how to cope with them when they come up in their own context.
I have a question about personal, like about Spain, about the case of Spain. You've been talking about Podemos, and for example, like now in Spain, this party, as you said, it gets like some spaces from this 15M, and they...
You have to speak into the mic. I don't think they're hearing you.
Sorry, I'm not...
Okay.
My question is like similar to the colleague, that when this party start to more organize it after the European elections, like on the media, on all the media and all the power structures, what is in Spain, they are like attacking them like really hardly and putting them like they are like terrorists, you know, I don't know if you hear something, and they are like really from the left side. And it's really hard, I think, from these parties when they are coming up and they start to organize, they construct really big borders because they are not interested. The people that are on the institutions, they are not interested on this system get unstabilized. So they have like still like the capital. So they have like much more tools than the new ones that are coming, and
yes.
And they find it even like I saw not long time ago, like in the European Parliament, one parliamentary from this party start to talk about some subject, and they really tell him like shut up, you know. And this is happening in our European institutions. So how we can go with these new ideas and how we can not fight, but more like these borders goes out of us, and we can really express ourselves.
Well, sure, it's a David and Goliath that we're facing. You know this image, David and Goliath. But you know, in some ways, it's much easier for us than it was for the people who made those mass parties in the late 19th century. Nobody can get anywhere in Spain now saying that the people who are trying to build Podemos are godless, anti-church. The secularism in a Catholic country like Spain now is overwhelming. So some of the most emotive things that were used against the formation of socialist parties 120 years ago is much less effective than it is today. Secondly, the kind of deference that I was describing, that Michel spoke about, where ordinary miners, textile workers, who had virtually no education, whose only access to education was a local priest, the deference they had for a socialist leader who spoke for them, whether a trade union leader or a communist leader or a parliamentary leader. That's much less present today because of the level of education, because of the media communication, because of the information available on the internet. I don't think that social networking is a substitute for organization. It's not. Right? Very easy to press a button. Right? Much more difficult to actually go to a meeting, learn how to speak, learn how to organize people, and so on. Create real solidarities by learning about each other in a personal way that you can never do, except face-to-face with your neighbors, your co-workers, and so on. But I think that the internet does give people access to other forms of information. So even if the whole bourgeois press is doing what you're saying, yes, nevertheless, there are other means of getting to people. So I'm not so pessimistic as you. I think that there is more space in certain ways than there's ever been for David to find the slingshot.
I agree with this, but just I find, for example, population in Spain, it's older, and it's like not all the people, for example, like the generation of my mother, maybe like the people who has upper studies, they are more used to check this new media, but most population not, so they are really easily manipulated, I would say.
Yeah. Well, this is a generational problem. On the other hand, people like your mother will have some memory of what was good about those who were defeated in the Spanish Civil War. Will have some memory of how bad those who were against the socialists and anarchists were. Right? So it balances out, I think. Look, what can one say? You have to engage yourself in the struggle, despite these limitations, and see how far you can go, both with your mother and with the younger people.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Leo, for your lecture and